Thank you. Well, welcome to everybody again to this session, the first of our training events for HESES22. And what we'll do as we're being joined by everybody, we'll go through some housekeeping. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. My name is Roger Lear and I work as a funding officer. In fact, I'm reminded that I should show you all what I look like. Hello, and I work in the funding round team at the OFS. If my link goes down, my colleague Ross Lawler will step in to take over from me. And in a moment, I'll be joined by my colleague Toby West-Taylor, who is the head of funding at the OFS. In terms of using Zoom, we have turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom so that captions are available if you click on the CC icon. The captions are automatically generated, so unfortunately there may be some errors in what's displayed on the screen because of the jargon that we use. I'm sorry, we can't really do much about that. Now, just a reminder here that the intended audience for this session is very much those that have come across HESES before. If you're new to HESES, we've got video resources and other webinars which will be starting later this week. Details of these can be found on our events webpage, the address of which I will give you in a moment or two. And for the questions that will inevitably arise out of today's topics, thanks to those of you who have submitted a question in advance of the event. We're also happy to receive questions during during the event itself. Please use the Q&A box for this, not the chat box. The chat box is for you to communicate with our events team if you need to. So please use the Q&A box. And in terms of feedback, for those of you that have agreed to take part in an evaluation survey, which you were asked when you were registering for this event, we'll be sending that to everybody after all our HESES events have finished. But in the meantime, if there's anything you particularly want to let us know about, you can give us feedback at any time by writing to us at the address, which I will be showing you shortly. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So today the format's going to be like this. My colleague, Toby West-Taylor, who, as I say, is the head of funding at the OFS, will shortly give us a presentation on the main changes in HESES22, and then we will go on to answering questions on these. Now, we'll try and keep the scope of the questions to HESES itself, changes to it and related policy issues. And we'll try to batch these together because common themes and issues emerge in these circumstances. So you may not hear exact question read out, but we will try to make sure that all questions have been addressed before we finish. However, if a response turns out or looks like it might be particularly lengthy or complex, we may suggest taking some discussions offline if that's appropriate. And if that's something you want to take up with us, as you know, because it's questions of confidentiality or whatever it may be, you can always write to us. And this is the address that you can see on the screen here on the bottom line: HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk. I will read out most of the links and addresses because I know that there are people who just rely on the audio. So that's why I'm doing that, for those that wonder. And I think we're ready now for the next slide, please. So this slide is describing some of the supporting materials that we've got for HESES. And as I will be saying again later, the Office for Students events page, officeforstudents.org.uk/events, that is a place to go to find things like the recording of this event when it's available. And we'll also put copies of today's slides there so you can refer to them. More generally, for HESES, the best starting point for HESES resources is the page that you can see there, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and there's a section there called supporting documents. So if you find that heading, you'll also find there are a couple of model HESES22 workbooks. So if you really want to, you could download those now and follow along. And my colleagues, I think, have or will be putting a link in the chat to that so you can get to that. There's also, under that heading, there's a book or a PDF called How to Complete the HESES22 Workbook, or I think we may have changed the title this year to Completing the HESES22 Workbook. But your main resource is going to be what we call the HESES22 guidance, and that's shown there with its full title, Higher Education Students Early Statistics Survey 2022-23 publication, and the link officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES22. There are other relevant background publications like the Guide to Funding that's being finalised at the moment, and also on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/officeforstudents, we've got some videos on HESES. There will be some sort of topic, topic, what's the word I'm looking for here? They're going to be more subject specific videos that we focus on there, and they're being revised at the moment. So you'll see updates to those going on as we move through the weeks before HESES is released. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, thank you. So I think that's all of the housekeeping over. I can see that pretty much everybody has logged on. So welcome if you were doing that while we were doing the housekeeping. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Toby West-Taylor, who is the head of funding, and he will take us through the major points about the changes to data collection for HESES22. So Toby, over to you.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Toby West-Taylor. I'm Head of Funding at the OFS. I'm going to talk you through the main changes to HESES22 data collection. I should say about the slides, there's quite a lot of material in the slides. These slides will be made available after the event. They include some links in the slides which you'll be able to click on once these slides have been made available on our website. And as I said, there's quite a lot of material in the slides, which I have done in order to ensure that there's some meaningful content basically available once the event is over. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk you through the main changes to HESES. I'm going to start by talking about the implications of data futures for HESES data collection. Data futures refers to the change to the specification of individualized data that providers will be submitting to the Higher Education Statistics Agency for 22-23. I'll then talk about changes to the HESES tables themselves and the associated guidance around those changes. And then, next slide please. I will talk you through some of the other changes and clarifications to the guidance itself. Obviously some of the changes and clarifications relate to the changes to the tables that we'll be going through. Some of the changes I would consider to be clarifications, but I suspect may have a real change in terms of what providers report on HESES. And there are a number of rather more technical and minor changes to guidance, not all of which are intended to actually change what you report compared to what you've previously reported. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'm going to talk about HESES data futures and what that means for HESES data collection. Now for 22-23, providers that make student data returns to the Higher Education Statistics Agency will do so under a new data specification, which has been referred to as data futures. This is being introduced with the end of year return for 22-23. So this is what providers will be reporting around this time next year in their data returns to HESES. I am not going to talk you through the detailed specification of HESES data futures, but suffice to say, under data futures, student activity is reported on a different basis to how it has been done before. It is done on the basis of a student course session rather than a year of instance. Now, a year of instance is language that will be familiar to everyone who has filled in HESES in the past. It is the concept of how we count students in the year and whether or not students are in the HESES population for the year. suffice to say that under Data Futures, the providers will return data and in a different format to previously, and it means that there is a difference in how students may be reported. Certainly when students change their status, such as if they change course or take a break in study, they will start a new student course session. Now that is not necessarily true under the old system of reporting years of instance. Now there are concepts such as funding completion, the fund comp field, that may therefore capture the status of an individual student differently according to the student course session compared with a year of instance. So funding completion relates to whether a student completed all they intended to do, at the moment defined in terms of a year of instance. So if they change their status, that might imply that the student is recorded as a non-completion. Whereas under a student course session, if they start a new course session and funding completion is measured against that, their completion status may be different. Funding completion is used by the OFS in our funding method to determine whether or not a student is counted for funding purposes. So this is a key issue for us. Now I appreciate that further education, sixth form colleges and academies that submit the individualised learner record to the Education Skills Funding Agency will still do so on the basis of years of instance. Next slide, please. So we had to consider how and whether the implications of HESES data futures should be reflected in HESES data collection for 22. And the issues that we considered in particular, that if we were to adopt the concept of a student course session for HESES 22, it would raise a number of challenges and risks. First of all, there would be a significant burden for providers that do not make data returns to HESES, so the further education sixth form colleges and academies, because if we expected them to make data returns in terms of student data, in terms of student course sessions, that is not a concept used for the ILR. Alternatively, we could end up with inconsistency in how providers report data according to whether they make submissions to HESES or the ILR. So if providers that made submissions to HESES did so in terms of completion of a student course session and others submitted completion in terms of a year of instance, that would result in inconsistency in how providers were reporting data. There would also be burden for providers that do make HESES student data returns in implementing data future specifications earlier than expected. As I say, the first return under data futures will be done this time next year. I'm conscious that providers are expected to make some submissions in the spring to show that they can make valid data returns. But if we adopted data future specifications in HESES 22, then providers would need to be able to capture that data and that specification much earlier when they make their submissions in November or December and sign off their data at the end of January. And the other important consideration is that if we changed the specification to refer to student course sessions, then there would be an unplanned funding redistribution between providers because of changes in which students were counted for funding purposes and how they were counted. And that is not something that we wanted to do. So for HESES 22, we have retained the concept of a year of instance as the basis for reporting student activity. So it is consistent with how providers have reported data in previous years, and it is consistent between providers in how they report data. So that has been a bit of a long introduction to explain why we have not changed things in HESES 22, but I think it's an important point to make clear the relationship between HESES data futures and HESES 22, because I know that will be a concern for many of you. The one other thing I should say is we have already been clear that we will not use the fund comp field submitted in either the 22-23 HESA or ILR data returns. We will not use that for funding purposes. You will be required to produce forecasts of non-completions by year of instance in the same way as you have previously, but we will not be seeking to reconcile that against your end of year 22-23 HESA or ILR data, because we will not use the fund comp field for our funding purposes in those returns. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk now about changes to the HESES tables for 22-23. The first two are more substantive, and both of them relate to new funding allocations that are being introduced for 22-23. And we are collecting data so that those funding allocations can be informed, those funding allocations for 22-23 can be informed by student data for 22-23. The purpose is to give an incentive to providers to increase activity in certain areas and to reward them to the extent that they do so in 22-23. So the first of these allocations relates to funding for students aiming for qualifications at level 4 and 5. There is £8 million that we expect to distribute in February 23 on the basis of the HESES data. And in order to do that, we need to know the population of students who are on courses leading to qualifications at level 4 and 5. So to achieve that, we have split the undergraduate level in HESES between those aiming for qualifications at level 4 and 5 and those aiming for any other qualifications or who are only aiming for credit. So this applies to most of the tables in HESES. It applies to tables 1 to 3. It applies to table 5, which is the data collected for planning purposes, and it applies to the new table 7, which I will come on to shortly. Now, the undergraduate level 4 and 5 applies to undergraduate students on courses leading to qualifications at level 4 and 5. It does not include students who may be studying at level 4 and 5, but whose course aim is credit rather than the qualification. And it does not include those who may be studying at level 4 or 5, but whose qualification aims are all at level 6 or above. The undergraduate other category is where those latter two categories should be reported. Now, an important point in this is about students with multiple stated qualification aims. The existing guidance in HESES still applies. Students with multiple stated qualification aims should be recorded against the lower aim. So if you have a student who is aiming for both a foundation degree and a degree, and those are both stated qualification aims of the student, then they should be recorded against the lower aim, the foundation degree, which is level 5, and therefore they would be recorded as aiming under the undergraduate level 4 and 5 category. Next slide, please. Now, the new table that we're collecting in HESES22 is table 7, and that collects information on degree apprenticeships. Now, again, this is to inform an allocation of £8 million to be allocated to students on undergraduate degree apprenticeships, which we intend to allocate again in February 23 once we have the signed off HESES data. Now, I talked about the level 4 and 5 qualification allocation. For that, we have a fairly simple funding approach that we intend, which is simply to distribute the total 8 million pro rata to the total numbers of students recorded against the undergraduate level 4 and 5 level as OFS fundable. This would be the column 4 and column 4A data. The proposal for degree apprenticeships is rather more complicated method. First of all, the incentive is much more focused on students starting degree apprenticeships in the year. And we are also looking to reward providers that do more than they have done in the previous year. So we're looking to really target the funding at providers that are growing their undergraduate degree apprenticeships. Now, there are two criteria for inclusion in Table 7. First of all, a student must be on an apprenticeship at level 6. And secondly, they must have a qualification aim of an undergraduate level 6 degree. Now, you can have students on apprenticeships at level 5 or level 7 who are aiming for an undergraduate degree. They are not on Table 7. Similarly, you can have students who are on a level 6 apprenticeship, but whose qualification aim may currently only be for a level 4 or a level 5 qualification, such as an HNC or an HND. If that is their only qualification aim, then again, they are not on Table 7. Student must meet both criteria. They must be on a level 6 apprenticeship and have a qualification aim of a level 6 undergraduate degree. Now, it may seem odd, but Table 7 allows students to be reported as either undergraduate level 4 and 5 or undergraduate other. But we expect the reporting of students against undergraduate level 4 and 5 on Table 7 to be very rare. And this is only possible where students have multiple qualification aims. So if you have an apprentice on a level 6 apprenticeship who has 2 qualification aims, let's say, again, a foundation degree and an undergraduate bachelor's degree simultaneously, then they would be recorded on Table 7 because they have a qualification aim of an undergraduate level 6 degree, but they would be recorded against the undergraduate level 4 and 5 level because they're recorded against their lower qualification aim, which is the foundation degree. Having said that, so it is possible, having said that, if you record students against the undergraduate level 4 and 5 level on Table 7, we will ask you about it and ask you to substantiate your reasons for recording students in that way, because we think it will be unusual. I think what more commonly happens with apprenticeships is that students may go through a succession of qualifications in series. For example, they may, as part of a level 6 apprenticeship, they may do an HNC. When they've completed that, they may then sign up for an HND to top up to an HND. And when they've completed that, they may then top up to a bachelor's degree. And in that situation, the point at which they meet the criteria for inclusion on Table 7 will be when they top up to the bachelor's degree, having completed the lower level qualifications. So in that situation, it would only be at that later point that the student would meet the criteria to be recorded on Table 7. Now, it is important that providers are consistent in how they record their activity between 21-22 in their individualized data returns and how they record activity in HESES22, because as you remember, part of the allocation method is designed to reward providers for doing more in 22, more compared to what they've reported in their 21-22 data returns. So we have obviously been looking at the data on apprenticeships in individualized data returns so far. And as I say, we think it is rare that students have multiple qualification aims as part of apprenticeships. Where this occurs, it does appear to be where a student completes one qualification aim during the academic year and then tops up to a further qualification aim. So it looks like they're doing things in series rather than simultaneously. So Table 7 collects both information on years of instance for students in all years of study on undergraduate degree apprenticeships, and it also collects information on those who are starting such undergraduate degree apprenticeships. And it is the starters that we'll be looking at to inform funding for 22-23. We're collecting the information on students in all years to inform our planning purposes, and also that data may be used to inform funding for 23-24, but no decisions have yet been taken on funding for 23-24. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the other changes to HESES tables are relatively minor. Table 6 collects, as you know, information on students on pre-registration courses in nursing, midwifery and allied health. Table 6A is for full-time, 6B has been for sandwich year out, and 6C is for part-time. And just to say, Table 6B, sandwich year out, has been removed. This reflects the fact that no data was submitted by providers at Table 6B in recent years, and indeed we would not expect any students to be reported as sandwich year out if they're on pre-registration courses leading to qualification in nursing, midwifery and allied health. Although such students will commonly do a lot of study in the workplace, our view is that that will normally meet the requirements for learning in the workplace and therefore count as full-time study, as opposed to work experience that might be classified as sandwich year out. If you think you have a sandwich year out student on a pre-registration course in nursing, midwifery and allied health, then do tell us and we'll be very happy to discuss it with you. We have not renumbered Table 6A and 6C, so Table 6C part-time is still called 6C. Within those tables, we have extended them to allow for the reporting of postgraduate pre-registration courses in dental therapy. Previously, there were none of these courses anywhere in England. We are now aware that there is at least one starting in 22-23, so this change enables that provider to be able to record their data appropriately. Now, postgraduate pre-registration courses in dental therapy should be reported in price group B. That is different to other pre-registration courses in dental therapy. The undergraduate courses are reported in price group A, but the postgraduate should be reported in price group B, and they should be recorded as postgraduate master's loan because they are not eligible under the undergraduate student support arrangements as things stand. The undergraduate student support arrangements do allow for postgraduate pre-registration courses to attract undergraduate student finance, but that does not extend to dental therapy because at the time the legislation was laid, no such postgraduate courses existed, so they were not named as eligible under the undergraduate arrangements. Now, we've also made two clarifications about what can be recorded on Table 6. One relates to foundation years and one relates to nursing associates. Foundation years for pre-registration courses should not be included on Table 6 unless they were part of the specific course that the relevant regulatory body approved, that is the Nursing Midwifery Council or the Health and Care Professions Council. So unless the foundation year was specifically part of the course that those regulatory bodies approved, it should not be on Table 6, even if it is integrated. Now, those integrated foundation years can still be reported on other HESES tables, so on tables 1 to 3, table 5, and indeed table 7 if relevant. But they should not be recorded on Table 6, and they will not attract the nursing and midwifery and allied health supplement that we provide in relation to students that are recorded on Table 6. The other clarification is to be absolutely clear that courses leading to registration as a nursing associate are not to be recorded on Table 6. Again, they can be recorded on other HESES tables, but they do not meet the criteria to be recorded on Table 6 because they do not lead to qualification as a nurse. And Table 6 collects information on registration, courses leading to registration as a nurse and other professions. It does not include nursing associates. Next slide, please. So I've talked through the main changes to the HESES tables themselves, and I'm now going to talk about some of the main areas of change and clarifications to the HESES guidance. Now, the first of these is about attendance and distance learning, and I think it's fair to say that this has slightly come to a head with changes in delivery during the pandemic, where we felt that further clarification was needed. I would emphasize, I consider this to be a clarification, not a change, but I appreciate that this may result in changes to how some providers may report their activity compared to what they were doing before. Now, there are 3 criteria for a year of instance to be treated as full-time, and they are unchanged. The first is that a student is normally required to attend the provider or elsewhere for periods amounting to at least 24 weeks within the year of instance. Attend relates to the 24 weeks. Within those 24 weeks, they are expected to undertake periods of study, tuition, learning in the workplace, etc., which on average amount to at least 21 hours a week. So the 21 hours does not apply to attendance, or does not entirely apply to attendance. They're not expected to attend for 21 hours a week, but they are expected to attend or required to attend for at least 24 weeks within the year. The third criterion is that full-time fees are chargeable for the course for the year, although this may not apply for apprenticeships. So the attendance requirement applies to the 24 weeks criterion only. And it means, what we mean by attendance is that the student is required to be at a provider location or other specified location, which could be a partner provider, defined workplace, etc. And during that time, they are required to undertake periods of study, tuition, etc. It applies to all students on the course, except where a student is unable to attend for reasons of their disability. And the significance of this clarification about attendance probably affects distance learning. So at this point, I'll say next slide, please. And this is to say that we have included the definition of distance learning in our HESES guidance. The definition we have adopted is the one that applies in student support regulations. So a distance learning course means a course on which a student undertaking the course is not required to be in attendance by the provider of the course, and required to be in attendance is not satisfied by any requirement of the provider to attend for the purposes of registration or enrolment or any examination on a weekend or during any vacation on an occasional basis during the week. So if you have a course which involves a student being required to come into the university or college to sit an exam, if you require them to attend a summer school or to attend a lecture or seminar on a Saturday, or any other sort of ad hoc attendance during the week, that is not enough to count as attendance for full-time purposes. That would be treated as a distance learning course, and if that is the limit of the attendance requirement, then the student would have to be recorded as part-time, not full-time, in HESES. So if the course meets the definition of a distance learning course as above, it will not meet the requirement to be classified as full-time in HESES. and such a student would therefore be recorded as part-time, but they can, the fact that they're studying at a full-time rate can still be reflected in the fact that they can be recorded as 1 FTE. Now, it's important to stress in all of this that there is a difference for student finance purposes. There is, for student finance purposes, a concept of full-time distance learning. And for a full-time distance learning course, the provider is able to charge fees of up to £9,250, regulated fees, but the student will generally not have access to maintenance loans. So for student finance purposes, and indeed for your fee charging purposes, the student may still be treated as full-time distance learning, and you will still be able to charge fees of up to £9,250. But in HESES, you'll be recorded as part-time, possibly with an FTE of 1. As I say, we think that is a clarification. There has always been an attendance requirement as part of the HESES definition. Next slide, please. Now we have some changes and clarifications to the guidance on level of study. I've already talked about one of those, which is about the fact that we're splitting the undergraduate level between students aiming for level 4 and 5 qualifications and others, and I'm not going to elaborate further on that. There are some other areas affecting the recording of students as postgraduate that we have made. The first is that graduate entry pre-registration courses in medicine and dentistry and veterinary science should be reported as postgraduate taught, subject to undergraduate level fees. There is nothing undergraduate about these courses. By definition, they are as graduate entry. A normal entry requirement is that students already have a degree. That makes them postgraduate. And by the sector recognised standards in England and the framework for higher education qualifications in other parts of the UK, pre-registration courses leading to qualification in medicine, dentistry and veterinary science lead to an award, a qualification at level 7. So there's nothing undergraduate about these courses at all. They can attract undergraduate student finance, and therefore they would be recorded as postgraduate taught undergraduate fee. I think it has been common practice for providers to report these as undergraduate in HESES, but this is really to make clear that they should be postgraduate taught UG fee. The other clarification is about the recording of students undertaking the Part 2 course leading to registration with the Architects Registration Board. This is to say that the recording of those students will vary according to the individual circumstances of the students taking the course. You may have just one Part 2 course leading as part of the leading towards qualification and registration with the ARB, but students on that course may be recorded against different sub-levels of postgraduate. So they're recorded as PGT UG fee, where Part 2 is treated for student finance purposes as a single course with Part 1. You should know who those are because they will commonly have their tuition fee loan paid by the student loans company. The student loans company will be recognising that the Part 2 course is being studied, if you like, as a continuation of the single course that the student started when they did Part 1. For any other students, they should be recorded against the postgraduate taught master's loan category. And this will apply if there's been a significant gap generally between the completion of Part 1 and the commencement of Part 2. So the recording of students on that Part 2 course will vary according to the individual circumstances of the students on it. The final issue is something I've already mentioned with dental therapy, the fact that there is a postgraduate dental therapy course that can now be reported in HESES, and that should be reported as postgraduate taught master's loan because it is not eligible for undergraduate student finance. If I could have the next slide, please. The next slide is really, I would consider not particularly significant and is more of the technical side. We have ensured some consistency of language in HESES in referring throughout to recognised courses. In previous years, you will have found some references to recognised qualifications. We're trying to be clear and consistent in our language and referring to recognised courses. There is no change to the definition of recognised courses. To be clear, that is to be recognised, a course must be either designated under the Education Student Support Regulations, those are the undergraduate student finance arrangements, or it must meet the definition of a course of higher education as defined in Schedule 6 of the Education Reform Act, other than one leading to a qualification in the Register of Regulated Qualifications. There's no change there. I'm aware that the Post-16 Education and Skills Act has introduced a change for the purposes of the Higher Education and Research Act to Schedule 6 of the Education Reform Act 1998. That is not reflected in HESES. You are not able to record activity in HESES22 according to the revised definition in the Post-16 Education and Skills Act, because that definition has not yet commenced, and it is indeed a separate question about whether the funding approach might change as a result of that change definition. So there is no change in HESES22 towards what is recognised courses of higher education for funding purposes. Could I have the next slide, please? The next one, or the next two slides, are quite the opposite. The definition has not changed, but actually there are some real changes to the classification of students in HESES. So the definition of home fee status is the same as it always has been. It refers to students who are eligible under the fees and awards regulations that date back to 2007 originally. But because there have been changes to those regulations, there are some new student categories that are eligible for home fee status from August 22. The first of these are students with Ukraine scheme leave. So students from the Ukraine who are on a new year of instance, i.e. this applies to both continuing students and new entrants who are in England under one of the three routes for those affected by the conflict in Ukraine, are eligible for home fee status and indeed for student finance. There are some links on this slide where you can find further information about the Ukraine schemes, and there is a further guidance as well from the Student Finance England practitioners website. So you have the links there and you'll be able to click on those once the slides are uploaded to our website. Similarly, there are some changes to eligibility for home fees relating to Afghanistan. Again, persons granted leave under one of the Afghan schemes and British nationals evacuated or assisted from Afghanistan who begin a new course on or after 1st of August are eligible for home fees. The emphasis here is on new courses, doesn't affect continuing students. Could I have the next slide, please? And then there are a couple of changes relating to people from British Overseas Territories and others. So these are slightly more complicated to explain, I have to say. So the first relates to family members of all persons who would be settled when in the UK, who begin a new course on or after 1st of August 22. They are all eligible for home fee status. Previously, this only applied to UK nationals and their family members. And then the second one is the family members of all persons settled in the UK who begin a course on or after 1st of August, subject to 3 years residence. Again, previously only the family members of UK nationals were eligible under this category. Now, if I can try and explain the difference between the two, the first bullet refers to all persons who would be settled when in the UK. Now, to be settled in the UK, you have to be in the UK. So you almost need brackets around the first sentence of the first sub-bullet. So this relates to family members of all persons who, if they were in the UK, would have settled status. They are now all eligible, subject to 3 years residence in the UK islands and British Overseas Territories, of which at least part was in the specified British Overseas Territories. They are eligible for home fees. The second category does not specifically refer to the British Overseas Territories, but it extends home fee status to family members of all persons who are settled in the UK. So it's not the theoretical situation of people who would be settled in the UK if they were in the UK. There is further guidance available on this, again from the student practitioners website from the Student Finance England. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. Obviously, these changes are not as significant as the changes introduced in the previous year relating to the effects of the UK's withdrawal from the EU and also changes to the eligibility of island students. So those changes continue as before. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, within home fee status, we then split students between either students who are OFS fundable and students who are non-fundable. We have changed the guidance to remove 3 categories of non-fundable students so that these can now count as fundable. But before you all get too excited about us counting more students, it's because we think there are none of these students left that we have removed the reference to them. So these categories of non-fundable students apply to students who started pre-registration courses in nursing, midwifery and allied health in a year when funding responsibility for those courses rested with the Department of Health and Social Care. So this relates to students on undergraduate, most undergraduate pre-registration courses that started before 2017, and students on postgraduate pre-registration courses and dental hygiene and therapy courses that started before 2018. We don't think there are any continuing students on those and under those circumstances, so those categories of non-fundable students have gone. It remains the case, however, that if you have students who are on courses that are fully funded from an NHS organisation, then those students will continue to be recorded as non-fundable by the OFS. And the last point on this slide is a minor point, that we've updated the guidance relating to the equivalent and lower qualifications policy to include reference to the sector recognised standards that apply in England. We're still referring to the framework for higher education qualifications for qualifications that may have been awarded in other parts of the UK. Could I have the next slide, please? Another change that we've made to the guidance is to extend the exceptional circumstances that may apply that prevent a student who is doing a year abroad from actually travelling abroad to undertake that year. Now, in the last couple of years, we've had exceptional guidance to recognise that because of the coronavirus pandemic and the actions of governments to manage that pandemic, students have been prevented from travelling abroad. And we have allowed that exceptional circumstance to mean that students can still be treated as if they were doing a year abroad, even if they're studying in the UK, if certain criteria were met. And those criteria were that the overseas higher education provider, rather than the provider in England, is providing the learning support for the student online, and also that the fees charged to the student for the year are no higher than the regulated fee limit that would have applied had the student been taking a normal year abroad. We have generalised those exceptional circumstances so that it's not just limited to the effects of measures to address a coronavirus pandemic, but it may also apply in relation to the effects of ongoing armed conflicts wherever they may be in the world. So those other exceptional circumstances may also be a reason why someone cannot travel abroad for a year abroad. The criteria that have to be met to be treated as a year abroad, though, remain unchanged. Could I have the next slide, please? And this, you may be pleased to hear, is my final slide, and this is relevant only to further education sixth form colleges. And firstly, it's just to note quickly that the courses table that further education sixth form colleges and academies complete has also been updated to reflect the fact that we've split the undergraduate level between level 4 and 5 and other. And the other point that we would like to really emphasize is that to be included in HESES, further education sixth form colleges must ensure that the courses that they want to report have valid learning aims, and that the learning aim information for each course is correct. And this must be done by the time the HESES data is signed off. So there are links at the bottom of this slide again, which gives further information about learning aims and how you can go about requesting a change to a learning aim. But the important point is that you must ensure that any courses you want to report in HESES have valid learning aims, and that information is correct. At that point, I will say, next slide, please, and we should be on to the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you, Toby. You can take a deep breath after all of that, so thank you for that. While Toby has been presenting, my colleagues have been monitoring the Q&A and been collating the questions asked with those that we've had from you before, and we'll now go through some of these and see if we can answer as many as possible. Let's go back to where you started, Toby. You talked about HESES data futures and the implications from that. So this is something which I think quite a few people may have in their minds. If you're not going to use fund comp in 22-23, will we still be required to apply a non-completion rate to our HESES totals? If so, how do you propose we calculate this, given that we are no longer required to key the fund comp? Well, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll let you do it because you'll probably say it better than me.
You are still required to forecast non-completions in HESES22. And as before, you should be doing that on the basis of historic data. When you complete HESES22, or indeed when you've completed it in previous years, you should not have been looking at each individual student and making an assessment of whether you think they will or will not complete their year of study. You should have been calculating a rate based on historic practice that reflects what has happened in the past, and which we would consider to be a better way of forecasting what might happen in the current year. So you still do that. You still forecast for HESES22 non-completions using historic data, the data in 21, 22, 2021 as needed. We have said providers should not use data from 2019-20 in forecasting their non-completions, and that remains the case because that was a year that was particularly affected by the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. And as a follow-up to that, somebody has, I may be the same person who posed that first question. HESES22-23 FundComp data is not going to be used. So will a HESES recreation file still be produced when we commit our 22-23 data futures data?
Yes, is the short answer. We will be producing a recreation. It will not be recreating FundComp or funding completion using the FundComp field in the HESES or indeed the ILR data for 22-23. We will probably do a similar thing to what we did in 2019-20, which was the first year affected by the coronavirus pandemic, where we can recreate the column 1 and column 2 data, but I think for the non-completions we probably applied the non-completion rates that were originally forecast for the year rather than using what had been completed in the individualized data returns. Yeah. So we will certainly be providing a recreation. We hope to do that rather earlier than we have done recently.
Yeah, that was.
But it will not be. It will not use the FundComp field.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there was the second part to that, which was, if so, can we have the technical recreation guidance as soon as possible to assist with our data return, and any chance it could be made available in time for HESES22? And I'm not sure about the second part of that.
It won't be in time for HESES22. I can categorically say that. But we do recognise the need to get this to providers as soon as we can. I mean, we're particularly conscious that providers are having to prepare for HESES data futures, and that this will hopefully help them. So we certainly want to get this to providers earlier than we have in recent years.
Also on this subject, if we do not return FundComp in 2022-23 HESES, what would be the basis for forecasting non-completion in HESES23, or will this cease to be a requirement in 2023?
That's a very good question, which I'm probably not going to answer. I have to say the issues remain. The issues that I set out in terms of what we've decided to do for HESES22 remain, because there is that difference in how students will be reported against student course sessions going forward. There are a number of possible options for how we resolve that, and it is something that is resolvable, but I'm not going to go into details about how we might do that. What I would say is that we will engage with providers about our approach going forward, so that they can feed into that discussion. Certainly, if there are any substantive changes that are to follow, but I think this webinar is not the place to start that discussion. But we're very live to the issue about what is collected in HESES23.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, we're really just concentrating on HESES22 today. But good question. Okay, nothing else at the moment on data futures, but we'll come back to that if anything does come through. And as I've said to everybody before, if you haven't heard your exact question read out, it's not that we're ignoring you necessarily, but we're getting themes emerging from a number of people, on a number of topics, and we collate and curate these so that we can deal with as many questions as possible. So looking now, Toby, at table 7 and the new table that we've got for degree apprenticeship. Somebody says, what about apprentices doing integrated masters?
Yes, if they have so an integrated masters would involve a qualification aim at level 7, and they do not meet the criteria for being recorded in table 7, because table 7 is about a study at level 6, so undergraduate level 6 degrees on level 6 apprenticeships. So they're not in the table 7 population. I think the concern about including them is if you start including level 7 qualifications, then what would be the argument for excluding other level 7 qualifications? So they're not in the population. The table 7 is very much about level 6, study towards level 6 qualifications.
Okay, yes. Also on this subject, is it acceptable to have a student who's studying an HNC as part of a progression to a Bachelor of Engineering registered on both aims?
Yes, is the short answer. Yes, that is acceptable. It's possible. In terms of splitting or assigning that student to a level, one of the undergraduate levels, because they're aiming for an HNC, that would determine the fact that they would be recorded against the undergraduate level 4 or level 4 and 5 classification, as opposed to the undergraduate other. I'm not clear if that question was about degree apprenticeships. Let's assume it was.
Yes, quite. Yes, table 7.
So
yeah.
if a student is on a level 6 apprenticeship and they have a qualification aim of both an HNC and a Bachelor in Engineering, then simultaneously, then they would be recorded on table 7 because they're aiming for a Bachelor in Engineering, and they would be recorded against the UG level 4 and 5, consistent with the other tables, because their lower qualification aim is the HNC.
Yeah, as you say, the important thing is that they're concurrently have those qualification aims.
Yeah, it would be different if they're going through a succession of qualifications, i.e. they only have an HNC as a qualification aim, and once they finish that, only then do they have the Bachelor in Engineering qualification aim. That would mean that they wouldn't be reported on table 7 until they had finished the HNC and were topping up.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning at this point that as part of our revision of the YouTube videos that we have on our YouTube channel, we are working on, and probably release fairly soon, an updated version of the video on apprenticeships, which will go into quite a lot of the table 7 stuff, which we hope will go some way to answering people's questions on this. So look out for that. That should be coming out soon on our YouTube channel. Good, thank you. We may well come back to that, but looking at the other new feature which you talked about, the splitting of undergraduate level into level 4 and 5 and other things to do with that. So somebody has written to say students with integrated foundation plus undergraduate. We could debate what that means. But the question is, should they be counted as level 4 and 5 then? No.
Their qualification aim, if it's integrated, their qualification aim is the undergraduate degree, level 6. The fact they're on a foundation year doesn't make them, doesn't change that. So they would be recorded as undergraduate other.
Yes, this is very much about what the qualification aim is, or what they are, isn't it?
Again, the question applies as to whether the student might have multiple qualification aims at the same time.
Yes.
In which case they'll be recorded against the lower of those. But to be UG level 4 and 5, you have to have a level 4 and 5 qualification aim.
Okay. Something else here in that kind of context, how do we determine if non-prescribed courses, like, for example, the Association of Accounting Technicians level 4 course, how do we determine if non-prescribed courses should be included in HESES given this extra funding? And I'll lump this one together with it before you answer, Toby, and any non-regulated learning, which I think might be saying the same thing, with a level 4 to 6, are we required to return them on HESES22?
The population covered by the HESES survey has not changed. I had that earlier slide about the definition of recognised courses, for which features in Annex B of HESES. So the definition of what courses are recognised is exactly the same as it has been in previous years, and that requires a student either to be on a course that is eligible for student finance, or it has to be a course that meets the definition in Schedule 6 of the Education Reform Act, other than one leading to a qualification in the Register of Regulated Qualifications. So you need to look at the Ofqual register. If you can find the qualification there, and it's not a course that attracts student finance under the Undergraduate Student Finance Scheme, then it's out. It's not in HESES. There are some courses on the Ofqual register that do attract undergraduate student finance, higher nationals being an example, and there might be some teacher training courses as well. But if it's on the Ofqual register otherwise, then it's not in HESES. And the reason for that is those on the Ofqual register generally get student finance through the advanced learner loans, and they are the funding responsibility of the ESFA, not the OFS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. We've got quite a few questions about mode and distance learning, which I think you might have anticipated, so let's get into those. Somebody's written, so this means all distance learning students are now part-time regardless of their FTE, and expanding on this, would other full-time for this would be other full-time for HESES Data Futures, which then translate to part-time for HESES. Yes, there's rather a lot here, so I'll just stick with that first one. So this means all distance learning students are now part-time regardless of their FTE? Question mark.
Essentially, if they don't meet the attendance requirement, then they will be part-time, and they may still have an FTE of 1, i.e. they still may be studying at a full-time rate and be funded accordingly. But they would be part-time if they don't meet that attendance requirement.
In HESES terms.
In HESES terms, and I would emphasise, I see this as a clarification. I think this has always been the case in terms of what our intention has been, even if that has not always been well understood necessarily, and is not necessarily reflected practice. And I think I accept that, you know, providers are familiar with how this might be treated for student finance purposes, where the concept of full-time distance learning most definitely does exist and enables you to charge full-time fees, as you may have already been doing. Another part of that question, Roger, was about the recording against other full-time in HESES. Now, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the precise definition of other full-time for the HESES record. It's
strange you should say that.
But I don't think it covers this. Frankly, okay, well, I think other full-time relates specifically to where a student is on a full-time course, but their final year of instance, as was, is short. So they might be, for example, on an 18-month course, and the last part of that course doesn't meet the 24 weeks requirement. This is something I may need to take away and discuss with colleagues, but I'm not sure that the distance learning would necessarily meet the criteria to be other full-time.
Yeah, the piece you've picked up on was what I was quoting from the follow-up, which was would this be then other full-time for HESES Data Futures? which then translate to part-time for HESES, distance learning. And if full-time distance learning must be returned as part-time in HESES22, do you expect those to be returned as part-time in HESES Data Futures or full-time other? So there are several points in there.
There are. As I say, my understanding is that they don't meet the criteria to be full-time other, and that would make them part-time.
Mm-hmm.
That is a point I will take away and discuss further with colleagues, because I appreciate this may well affect how the data is used for other purposes beyond funding.
Yeah. Yes, we are getting deep into the weeds here, and I'm aware of the time moving on. So for those of you who have submitted questions and in this neck of the woods, as Toby said, he's going to make some inquiries about this. If you feel that we haven't actually got to the bottom of what you've asked, then please do drop us a line at heses@officeforstudents.org.uk, flagging exactly what it is that you would like clarified, and we will take steps to give you the relevant information in the light of Toby's review. So yeah, we appreciate that this is, as Toby said, something which there may have been some ambiguity about in the past. Okay, let's move on. Given that the clarification around attendance is a clarification and not a change, are providers expected to include this in the individualized returns for 21-22? We now realize we've been getting it wrong all this time, so presumably we need to reflect it there and request to make changes to previous collection. I think that's meant to be, do we make a request to previous collections?
It is something that you can do. I would not want this to interfere with, what you're able to do in order to meet the HESES deadlines. But I think if you think you're significantly affected by this, and that it will change in 1 year or another how you report students to HESES, then that's something that we should discuss with you, so that we understand exactly how you're affected and any implications that may have on our use of the data. Okay.
Just one which one of my colleagues has sent a comment about the next question, which says, does this definition, which I take it is just I'm not quite sure which part of that it's referring to, but does this definition also apply to the financial monitoring return? Now that's something which is dealt with in a different team, and my colleague has written that the team that deals with this is aware of the recent query about how to record in the annual financial return, the AFR. So queries on that front should go to finance data at officeforstudents.org.uk, and they will be able to assist you with that. Pressing on, question about the 24 weeks. At the moment, we assess this based on the period of active study, as students can be doing any number of activities, which could be campus-based, remote, or individual study, and so on. We're not sure any longer how to count the 24 weeks. Is a given calendar week in which there was a single teaching event that students were required to attend one of the 24 weeks, or should we count that single day as one of the 24 times 7 days, or 24 times 5 days, that a student has been required to attend? Is a week any period of 7 consecutive days, or is it a calendar week? So
what I would point you to, I suppose, as to start with, is the treatment of distance learning for student finance purposes, and how the recording of courses are treated for that. The 24 weeks is a 24 weeks attendance requirement. It does not specify how much attendance is required. during those 24 weeks. What it does say is that any requirements to attend at weekends or in vacations do not satisfy that attendance requirement. So it does require 24 weeks attendance. It doesn't specify how much attendance during the week, but it does say the attendance requirements excludes any attendance on an occasional basis during the week. So I think, as I say, look at how this might be treated for student finance purposes. Is the SLC treating this as full-time or as full-time distance learning or part-time? We're looking to be consistent with that in one sense, although I recognise that student finance has a concept of full-time distance learning, whereas we just have a choice between full-time and part-time.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Please, can you clarify the distinction between part-time and full-time higher education student on an apprenticeship for the duration? Why would they be considered part-time if they are attending / studying as much as full-time?
I think the concern has been, and I acknowledge that this can be unclear. I mean, first of all, we in terms of our criteria for being full-time, the third one is that a full-time fee is charged. Now, obviously, fees are not being charged to apprentices, so that one falls away generally or often. In terms of the other criteria, what we look at for a student on an apprenticeship to be recorded as full-time is that they are studying at a similar rate to an ordinary full-time student in terms of their study over the duration of the course that is part of the apprenticeship, and within each year. Apart from that, it is tricky. I mean, there is an expectation, of course, that an apprentice is generally employed for 30 weeks, at least 30 weeks. Sorry, at least 30 hours in the week, and that will therefore suggest that they're full-time employed, which brings into question whether they are studying full-time. But I think it can be possible. Obviously, you can be employed, but spending a significant amount of time studying at the same time. So if you are studying at a full-time rate and you meet the criteria in HESES, then it is possible for apprentices to be recorded as full-time.
Yes, one of my colleagues is just adding a note here that there are additional criteria that apprenticeships apply in the case of apprenticeships that can meet to be qualified as full-time. So there's a lot in the guidance on that, isn't there? So that's worth mentioning. Okay, question on HESES definitions, home fee status and fundability. PGT undergraduate fee students cannot be recorded in price group A. So what do we do with graduate entry medics?
PGT. That's.
I'm just getting some further clarification come through on this.
Yeah, I'm just.
Yes, I think that's referring to the fact that in the HESES workbook, the PGT undergraduate fee line is grayed out so that to show it's not available.
Right, yes, it is indeed. I don't think that's correct. Good spot.
We will need to investigate that one. So thank you for that. Bringing that to our attention. I'm not quite sure.
That would apply. I mean, with a, let's say, a 4-year graduate entry medicine course, the first year would be in price group B. The second, third and fourth year would be in price group A.
Yeah.
And they would be under the PGT UG fee. I think that
okay, well, we'll look at that.
I think that is something we need to look at. Our shading may have gone awry. Yep,
thank you for that. So let's move on to another one on the HESES definitions. If determining if a course is long and vacation periods are excluded from the calculation, does this mean that if the combined Easter and Christmas vacations total 8 weeks, then no courses could be returned as long? So that's 45 weeks, isn't it? Is the criterion for establishing a long course?
Yes. I suppose the question is the time expected. I think the 45 weeks was established, it has to be said, a long time ago, but was with a view in particular to how students on master's courses will commonly study, in order to reflect what they do. So I think we would expect, commonly that students on postgraduate master's courses would be recorded as long as they're doing that over, within one 12-month period, as is typically the case. And
yeah, okay, well, I hope that's answered that. We are beginning to run out of time, so I'm just going to try and zap through a few of these, Toby. Somebody has written that it is a challenge to get learning aims approved quickly for recent validations, and one of my colleagues has said that we will, what's the expression, we will, if you can prove that you're engaging, I think, with the ESFA on that, then we'll tend to look at this sympathetically. We can issue temporary learning aims, can't we? So I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Toby.
No, but all I can say is engage as early as you can with the ESFA over it. I mean, we're in September now.
Yes,
we obviously want all of these correct by the time the data is signed off on the 30th of January 2023.
Yes, and as I was also going to add that learning aims are of course needed for the courses table, which is where the column 1 students are recorded, and therefore, providers should be getting these up and running before recruiting one normally. So that would normally be before the census date. So this should be something which should work okay. I think the suggestion is that it's taking a bit longer than usual, but that's for the ESFA, I'm afraid. Any chance of updating when the result of the burden review will be published? I'm not sure if this is your area, Toby.
We are working on it at the moment, but I don't know a timetable for when that'll be available.
Okay, it may be possible for us to get an update on that from one of our colleagues. So again, if you want to drop us a line on that, we'll see what we can do on that one. Will there be, I assume this means, a consultation regarding predicting completion rates? We still await the very overdue consultation outcomes for HESES data futures. Without the output from those, how can we be confident HESES won't change last minute as a result of these consultation outputs?
I read that as a question about what might happen in the future and in terms of future data collection as opposed to HESES22. As I said earlier, there are a number of options for how things might play out over time, including what we use as a volume measure going forward, but we will engage with providers on any changes to data collection that are, in relation to our funding method.
Yeah, okay. Let me just have another look here. I realise we're getting towards the end of our allotted time, so we'll see if we could squeeze in as much as possible. But we have an updated guide on how to establish FTE for non-prescribed courses, please, in the data futures. For example, AAT level 4. Well, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Toby, because one of my colleagues has put in a comment on that one. Which is to say that we're hoping the ESFA will have some guidance and that we're liaising with them on the specification in the ILR. But I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Toby.
No, that's fine, Roger.
Yeah, okay. HESES seem to be treating Gibraltar resident British nationals as non-fundable, which I think is wrong. Can you clarify?
Sorry, HESES
seem to be treating Gibraltar resident British nationals as non-fundable, which I think is wrong. Can you clarify?
I think that's one I'd need to take away and just understand what guidance HESES are providing on this.
Yeah.
But obviously there have been a number of changes to fee status eligibility affecting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we are rapidly approaching 3 o'clock. So thank you all for your comments and questions. And I'm just looking back over the list that we've been given. And I think we've got, I hope, all of them, but if not, then most, if not all. And as I've said a couple of times, if there is anything which you feel hasn't been properly answered or you need further clarification on, do please let us know. So can we conclude by having the next slide, please? Thank you. So as noted earlier, today's session it has been recorded and will be on the website. But for those of your colleagues who are perhaps new to HESES, we've got further sessions coming up. We were going to run 4 webinars, but due to the changes that we had to take account of for the recent period of National Mourning, we've had to cut that down a bit. We've got, instead of a webinar, we've got a recording which we're going to release very soon on an introduction to OFS funding and HESES22. And then we've got a couple of live events on categorizing your students and identifying and counting them in the HESES22 return. And we'll follow that up with a recording on the submission and verification of your HESES22 data. It's not too late to request your attendance at the live events, 2 bullets in the middle there. And you can find out more at officeforstudents.org.uk/events, and you'll find out more there. Can I have the next slide now, please? In the meantime, thank you. You can find out more, as I have said before, the HESES pages on the website are officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. And on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/officeforstudents, we're updating the resources on there. And again, for any questions which occur to you later or that you feel you need further clarification on following today's event, HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk is where you need to go. And that includes if you've got any feedback. As I said at the beginning, we did ask if people were interested in doing a feedback survey. If you've said yes to that, then we'd be very grateful if you can do that when they are sent out, which will actually be after the other 2 events, but we'd be grateful to hear anything from you. So can I have the next slide again, please? Which is just to say that because this has been rather a marathon, thank you all for staying with us and listening and watching. And we hope to see you again next time around. So take care, and when you're ready you can click on the leave button and we will conclude things there. Thanks very much.